But talking about the rising India story, remember, one pillar of it is built on rising economic heft. But most analysts say that India will cross the $5 trillion mark before the end of this decade, as early as 27, 28. And then, of course, there is the rising stature. India has taken a very different position from its Western partners when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. It's also taken a very nuanced position when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war that's happening right now in Gaza. All of this has implications for India, and yet India is able to carve its own space in these pressing matters that are facing global policy makers. We've also had the recent elections in Taiwan, where for the third unprecedented term, the Democratic People's Party has won. William Lai is going to be the new president of Taiwan, and he represents a political constituency there which does not believe in reunification with China. It does not want any kind of truck with China or any kind of reunification with China. It in fact wants Taiwan to maintain its autonomy, its independence, and move in the direction of an independent nation of the Republic of China. So, to try and make sense of all of this, I'm now joined by one of the most influential foreign policy voices in the world right now. Mr. J Grossman is from the RAND Corporation. Thank you very much, Mr. Grossman, for speaking with us. You've been in India for a few days now. What have you seen around in this country, and what are your thoughts from your travels here in India? Many say that you feel a certain energy, you feel like India is at a pivotal moment in its development trajectory. It's the fastest growing economy in the world. Strategically, it's of huge importance, whether in the Indo-Pacific or in all of these theaters of war that I just mentioned. India's view seems to count. What are your thoughts and impressions of what this moment means for India from an outsider's point of view in the time that you spent, the last few days that you've spent here in India?
I believe India is an emerging great power. I've gotten some pushback from some fellow colleagues on that, basically who make the argument that India still has a long ways to go. And there are certainly challenges. Challenges with dealing with socioeconomic development, right? Dealing with other things like that. But by the same token, and as you point out in your opening, India really is sitting at the strategic crossroads of the world. It's being courted by not only the United States and Russia, but even China itself, in spite of the border dispute along the line of actual control. And India, as I think demonstrated at the G20 summit last year, has become the voice of the global South in many ways. And the question that comes up is, what is India going to do next? And as Russia continues to wage the U.S. along with its European partners, as well as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, others, who are very perturbed by Russia's actions and have signed on to sanctions. They are looking at India. Can India do the same, or why isn't India willing to do the same? And so, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to point out that India is going to have to make some hard decisions going forward. Now, India's traditionally policy to maintain its strategic autonomy, I don't see that changing anytime soon. And that has been kind of a theme of my trip here, that India does not plan to change. India plans to still be India, right? But India's status in the global system is changing, and perhaps, and so I think that something is going to have to give, and we'll have to see how that pans out over time.
So in your travels here, and you mentioned this in the early part of your answer, there are some factors that are still, according to you, holding India back. What, in your view, are those factors, particularly when it comes to a strategic point of view or strategic thinking? What is it that's holding the country back from realizing its true strategic potential?
Well, I mean, so we just saw India become the most populous country in the world, surpassing China, right? But having the most people doesn't mean that you have fully kind of taken care of the people within your country, right? And so I think, and it seems to me like the Modi government is very focused on this, right? To improve the quality of life in India, right? There's still a lot of poverty, unfortunately. There's a lot of need to develop infrastructure here. And so I think that is a big aspect of finally becoming not just not being an emerging great power, but actually being a great power. But when you look at what economically now the fifth largest economy in the world, perhaps soon to be number four or even higher, right? I mean, that's a very good sign. India also has nuclear weapons. The United States support, and Russia, by the way. It's rare that the two agree on something, but both the U.S. and Russia want India to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Like I said, India is being courted from all sides, pretty much on all issues. So there's a lot of good reasons to believe that India now is in a really good position. But in position, it's going to have to focus a little bit more energy on again improving the lives of everyday Indians, but then being able to
Okay.
leverage that for its foreign policy, because a good foreign policy really starts at home. But look, it, with all of that aside, Modi and the BJP run government has actually done, I think, a pretty outstanding job. I mean, strengthening ties with the United States, and albeit a lot of it is due to China, but nonetheless, doing that, right, I think puts India in a really good position because there's a lot of benefits that can accrue
I do want to talk
closer
about the
relationship with the
wars
United States,
you
as we saw.
referenced to, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Hamas. And just in the last few days, we now know that US and UK coalition forces have been bombing parts of Yemen because the Houthi rebels there have been targeting the Red Sea shipping lanes, one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. And this is, of course, a huge concern around the world as to whether this is a turning point in a way that this war has become wider. It's now acquired much more of a regional nature, a regional conflict, if you will. What would you say to address those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge concern, right? I mean, and you say that it could be a turning point to a wider war. Well, there's a lot of other potential turning points, right? So if Israel and Hezbollah, um, engage in occasional shelling across the border between Israel and Lebanon. But if there's a full-blown war to Israel's north, as well as the ongoing war in the south, I mean, that could certainly bring Iran into play, which would probably bring the United States and some of its allies and partners into play. The last scenario and the most worrying scenario, right? That we would want to see. And so, this is concerning what we saw in the last 24 hours with the U.S. and UK strikes on the Houthis. But at the same time, point out that the United States continues its diplomacy throughout the Middle East. I mean, I can't count the number of times Secretary of State Tony Blinken has visited the Middle East since October 7th, right? So it's not just, the U.S. is not just conducting, military operations, but is also trying to tamp down further tensions as it, responds militarily in select circumstances.
I also do want to talk about the other war, which is the one between Russia and Ukraine. It's going to be 2 years since it began next month. When it started, it was almost existential, certainly for Europe, because it was the first big war that we saw since the end of the Second World War in continental Europe. Today, are we in a position to say that the only way this war is going to end is if Ukraine concedes that it's going to lose a substantial amount of territory that it controlled before the start of this war, and that Russia, as things stand today, will not lose this war? It's not in a position to lose this war. And if that's the case, what does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for the future of Europe? And frankly, what does it mean for America's standing in the world? Because this entire war effort, to a large extent, was funded and supported by America.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is the conflict is stalemating at best, and at worst, the Russians may actually have some advantages now. And because my understanding is that the Ukrainians are mostly in a defensive posture, and the on the offensive now in limited form, but that is different than what we saw maybe about a year ago. And then you also have the United States signaling that funding has run out to support the Ukrainian resistance, and that's because of domestic politics back. And so President Biden is really in a bind when it comes to trying to do more to help Zelensky and the resistance. That's probably not a good thing for our. I mean, well, it's not a good thing for our international standing. Those who believe that we should be supporting Ukraine, right? But of course, if you're in India, here in India, right? I mean, the Indians have been very neutral in the conflict, right? And so I don't think it necessarily harms our image with India, and it probably doesn't harm our interests or our standing, rather, South, right? Because the global South has tried to, like India, remain neutral in this conflict, right? Now, if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing, I mean, you're kind of licking your chops, saying, this is the moment where the U.S. abandons Ukraine, and Russia can then conquer Ukraine, and then also it speaks to China that the U.S. may make these grand sort of statements about the need to support democracy around the world and with its allies and partners to support them when they're being attacked, right? But at the end of the day, the U.S. eventually runs out of steam. And so when you're thinking, so again, if you're in Beijing and you're Taiwan, this kind of, if that's the scenario that takes place, that we can't support Ukraine anymore, well, that's going to embolden Beijing to do more against Taiwan, because they're probably going to think the same type of thing will happen.
I want to talk about that, not least because that's your specialization, Indo-Pacific and Taiwan. And we saw this pretty significant election over the weekend where William Lai Ching-te, won a historic third term for the DPP, and the DPP has historically not been in favor of reunification with China. They're seen as the anti-China party. What does this situation necessarily mean for cross-strait ties? Do you see Xi Jinping, and you can reference to his New Year's Eve speech as well, where he said reunification is just inevitable. Do you see Xi Jinping looking around the world, looking at all these strategic pieces, and he says, the U.S. is bogged down in Israel, Gaza, the U.S. is bogged down in Russia, Ukraine. This is perhaps his best and opportune moment for some kind of a military adventure across the Taiwan Straits. Do you see that happening?
Well, China certainly is unhappy that William Lai won the election. Past has stated that he is a pro-independence worker or pro-independence supporter of Taiwan. But I don't anticipate China taking any kind of immediate military action. What we saw after Lai's predecessor won, Tsai Ing-wen, who was also with the DP, Beijing waited until she gave her inauguration address in May of 2016. So that was 5 months after she was elected, in order to decide how it was going to respond. And by the way, in 2016, it was not a military response that threatened the island. What we did I guess we did see a military response after then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August of 2022. And so that, we learned a lot about how China plans to threaten Taiwan. And I think it served to try to intimidate Taiwan into submission. And so I wonder if we're going to see something like that after Lai gives his inauguration address in May. Of course, I hope not, but much higher now that Lai has won. If the KMT's Ho Yo-i had won, or the TPP's Ko Wen-je had won, I think we would probably have a different outcome.
And so are we going to see these various sort of theaters? You already have Russia, Ukraine, you have Israel and Gaza, China, Taiwan. There's, of course, the North Korea situation. They've just tested a hypersonic missile today. Do you see these various theaters and various actors, and the big ones are Russia, Iran, China, their interests sort of colluding in a way that it makes sense for them to be on the same page, come together, because ultimately all of them are threatening the US-led established world order? So do you see a lot more of these flare-ups in the years coming up, and the area of those flare-ups widening? Right now it's one in Europe, one in Asia, a couple in Asia actually. There's one in the Middle East, there's one in China, Taiwan, but more and more of these theaters expanding.
Well, I mean, we can't make too much out of it, right? Own national interests. All the countries you mentioned have their own national interests. And so they're looking out for themselves first and foremost. Yes, there has been greater sort of interactions between them, and a general sense of alignment between and among them in order to oppose the United States. That is, I mean, that is something which I think would be immediately tested if there were a war. Right, and chances are, because none of them have security treaties with each other, that if one is attacked, the others are not going to attack back on their behalf.
Mm-hmm.
That is we've looked very. I mean, I and a lot of my colleagues at RAND and elsewhere have looked very closely, for example, at China's relationship with Russia. Right, there is no alliance between China and Russia. Right, and so Russia is not going to support by attacking the United States in a war, right, between China and the United States, or at least we don't assess that that's the case, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe the one exception could be China's relationship with North Korea. They do have a special alliance that was renewed recently. And so that may be kind of one exception to the rule. But for the most part, the countries you've mentioned, especially with Iran and its relationships with Russia and China, they do not have any such agreement. And they're going to probably look out for their own interests if there is a war to come. Hopefully not, of course.
And a final word, which is on domestic U.S. politics, 2024 being a rematch of 2020, Biden versus Trump. Most polls suggest that if the election were to happen today, Trump would beat Biden. He's leading Biden in almost all of the swing states. Even nationally, he has a substantial lead over Biden. If Trump were to return to office in 2024, what happens to these various theaters, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza? Does Trump take a very hands-off kind of approach to these problems?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what one of the nominees would do going forward. I'll just say, though, because Trump was president in the past, I mean, it's clear that he was trying to reset the relationship with Russia. And so that would have implications for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He, Kim Jong-un, and had 3 different engagements with him. And so I think that relationship would improve. And with China, Taiwan, I mean, it's not. I don't think Trump was entirely clear about his views on Taiwan while he was in office in his first term, and is kind of to be determined. Although he did want to have a good relationship with China, especially based on the U.S.-China trade deal that was signed back in 2018. And so, I mean, that kind of gives you a sense of what he would do. But it's obviously very difficult to tell what he would do, and also I don't want to. What he might or might not do.
Derek Grossman, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and that comprehensive discussion on these various theaters of war and what the strategic implications therein are for even countries like India. That's a wrap. I'll catch you again tomorrow night, same time. It's Brass Tacks at 9 p.m. with me, Zakir.